My lady, can I check, please, that you can see and hear the inquiry room?
I can. Thank you very much, Ms. Doven. Good morning.
My lady, may I call the first witness, please, Mr. Matthew Coffey?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Matthew James Coffey.
And Mr. Coffey, you ought to have in front of you a 328-page witness statement that bears the number INQ 000588111.
That's correct.
You got that? And can you confirm, please, that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can confirm.
And I think it's right, Mr. Coffey, that you're the Chief Operating Officer and that you're also the Deputy Chief Inspector of Ofsted.
That's correct.
And the statement that you've provided, is that on behalf of Ofsted?
It is.
And have you prepared it in particular with the assistance of Baroness Amanda Spielman,
Yes.
who was the former His Majesty's Chief Inspector of
Indeed.
Education? I'm grateful. Mr. Coffey, can I just start then, please, by asking you a bit about the position at the outset of 2020 and Ofsted's overall assessment as to the standards that had been reached or were reached by most schools in England?
Immediately before the pandemic, 86% of schools in England were judged to be good or better. We were seeing a trajectory of continued improvement. We were content with the quality of education. We were concerned about a number of things that we talked about in the annual report at that time. That was particularly around those children that were starting secondary school and their prior attainment. And we were particularly concerned that those children that had lower prior attainment were likely to be from a special educational needs background or have special educational needs. So we were very clear that this was an area of concern. We also were concerned about the area SEND arrangements, the system that supports.
Just going to stop you there so that we can just take this one step at a time. So in terms of schools concerned about children transferring to secondary aged 11 who had special educational needs, correct?
That's right.
And then you referred just there to concerns about areas and their arrangements. Are you referring there to local authority areas as well? Is that what you mean?
That's what that was referring to. And we were also concerned about off-rolling children that were leaving the school system and potentially ending up electively home educated. They were the concerns before the pandemic.
And can I also ask you, the inquiry has heard a bit of evidence about the disadvantage gap as well. So children whose attainment was lower and who also came from more socio-economic disadvantaged families as well. Was that a concern to Ofsted?
It's always been on Ofsted's radar. It's always been a concern. It wasn't in a trajectory that was giving us deep concern, but it was certainly something that we continue to keep a very, very close eye on.
And does Ofsted agree then that that disadvantage gap continued to exist?
Yes.
And was present at the outset of 2020?
Yes.
And then you mentioned there off-rolling. So is it correct then off-rolling is when children leave school and Ofsted has no information as to what school they go to thereafter?
Yes, the definition of off-rolling is a child that is taken away from the school register, but without an exclusion code or any obvious reason. And of course, children leave school for lots of reasons. Families move. But we were particularly concerned with those children that didn't appear on another school register. So we keep a very close eye on the reasons why that might be.
And was there concern then, and I'm aware when I asked that question that Ofsted had done some research into this in 2018, about some of the reasons that appeared to be given or the understanding that existed as to why children were being off-rolled?
Yes, we were particularly concerned that children's families were being encouraged to exercise their legal right to electively home educate these children. And because we have no access to, there is no register of these children, they disappear. And we were deeply concerned that without being able to see where these children were, we were unable to assess as to whether that decision was in the best interests of those children.
And I think Mr. Coffey will return to this in due course. That's a concern that has become more pressing.
Yes.
Is that
Yes,
correct?
that's correct.
Over the course of the pandemic.
Yes.
And since the pandemic. All right. We'll come back to that. I just want to then move to the period leading up to the announcement that schools would close to most children, as was made on the 18th of March 2020. First of all, can you explain whether or not Ofsted was in contact with government prior to that announcement being made and providing information or intelligence to government about the sorts of difficulties that schools were encountering?
No, it was the other way round. The Department for Education was talking to us, me in particular, about some of their concerns. And whilst we've never had access to live attendance data, nor did we have access to schools that were closing, the Department for Education was sharing that information in the period immediately prior to. But our advice was not sought about what they might want to do.
That's what I was going to move on to and to ask you. I mean, presumably through its inspectorate functions, Ofsted acquires a huge amount of knowledge about schools and local authorities and the sorts of challenges that they face on a day-to-day basis. Is that correct?
It is, yes. At the time, immediately prior to the pandemic, I had about 1,700 people that worked in Ofsted, and at least 750 of those were people from a professional background as an inspector or a regulator, very likely to be a qualified teacher, probably likely to have been a previous head teacher, and in the social care world, very likely to have a social care qualification as well. So yes, I have a huge amount of experience at my disposal.
So just going back to the point that you made, did the Department for Education then come to Ofsted in the weeks leading up to the announcement to close schools to seek insight into the sorts of challenges that Ofsted thought schools might face if they had to close to most of their pupils?
No, but of course, in our assessment of the state of education of things that we were concerned about in the immediate run-up, they were all published and freely available. But there was no specific, can you come and help us think through this problem as it's starting to grow?
And, I mean, would Ofsted have had valuable information to offer and intelligence to offer had government made that approach?
Yes, is the answer to the question. And in my witness statement, you'll see that although this is after the decision has been taken to close schools, Baroness Spielman was very clear that she was offering to take a good number of those inspectors, as many as was needed, to help think through the policy changes, but those offers were not taken up in the scale that we had offered.
And I mean, does Ofsted have an insight into why that offer wasn't taken up or why the government didn't make that sort of use of Ofsted?
I think that at that stage, and I'm talking very, very early weeks, that there was concern about independence. Ofsted is independent, although we are civil servants. And so we understand very clearly what our independence is about, but we did feel that actually you could mitigate that very clearly by pivoting towards a national emergency. But I think that was probably a barrier. It eased throughout the pandemic that I'm sure we'll come to talk about later.
All right. And can you help me as to when Ofsted became aware then that schools would close to most children?
At the point that everybody else was made aware, where there was a national announcement.
And what would Ofsted assessment have been if someone had asked in the weeks leading up to the 18th of March, how ready do you think schools would be to pivot to the provision of remote education, for example, to most children of school age?
Well, we weren't asked that question ever, with the benefit of hindsight, although probably at the time the answer would have been the same. We didn't think that schools were prepared in any way, shape or form to be able to deal with educating children remotely.
All right. I'm going to move on then, if I may, to ask you about a specific policy that I think you're familiar with. We've called it the Vulnerable Children Policy,
yes.
But it was the policy adopted by the government in England so that certain categories of children could go to school. And you'll be familiar, very generally, children with a social worker, children with an education, health and care plan, and then a broader discretion that schools could deem children vulnerable. At paragraph 381 of your statement, which is at page 136, Mr. Coffey.
Yes.
Do you see that you cite there a briefing paper that was prepared on the 27th of April? And it set out a bit about the policy, and then it set out, you might just see at the end, at the end of the middle paragraph, it said, in an ideal world, these decisions would be risk-based and made on a case-by-case basis. But as we know, defining a child as vulnerable is no guarantee that they will go to school. I wanted to try and understand, if I may, whether Ofsted's point was that if you had the benefit of time, schools would identify children individually on a risk basis that they thought should come into school, or whether Ofsted was saying something different when it made that point.
No, Ofsted's view is clear that it's a head teacher of a school that understands their pupils better than anybody else, understands the circumstances with which they live. They will likely to know their parents and all of those arrangements. So our position was at that point that that's what we were talking about.
And so was the concern about the policy that by defining certain children who would be entitled to go, but still leaving an area of discretion as well, let me ask the question, was there concern about that on Ofsted's part, or did Ofsted think that was a balanced approach and the right approach to take?
I think we didn't have the benefit of the scientific data, the modelling, or any of the constraints that were trying to be navigated by the policy, other than a general view that, you know, schools like everybody else would be affected by the pandemic and therefore the capacity would be lower. I think that this was a pragmatic place to start, and we were relieved that at least there was that ability for a head teacher to work with local authorities to identify those additional vulnerable children.
May I just ask you about something you've just said there, which is that Ofsted didn't have access to the scientific advice or information. Do you mean that prior to the 18th of March,
yes,
Ofsted didn't know what SAGE, for example, was saying about, for example, the possibility of school closures, or perhaps the sorts of, or the percentages of children who might safely be able to attend school?
That's correct. We didn't have those data.
And do you think it would have been useful for Ofsted to have been provided with that sort of material at an earlier point?
I think it would have been essential had we been invited to be part of the discussion, yes, about forming a policy that would help navigate the way through. As it turned out, because we're not a policy-making department, we didn't need to have that additional data because it would have had less value to us. So we weren't being asked the question about whether the policy was right.
All right. So only a problem had your expertise, yes, been sought out in the first place. Did it become apparent to Ofsted at an early stage that vulnerable children were attending school in small numbers?
Yes, it became apparent very quickly, as my evidence suggests. In our discussions with head teachers, later on we were able to establish that. But really, from the moment that schools were closed, I had a very small cohort of school inspectors that joined us in the January of 2020, and very quickly the first decision we talked about redeploying our staff was to send those inspectors back to their schools to help. And they were talking to us very early on that these children were just not attending.
And does Ofsted have any particular insight as to why children weren't attending, or what it considers the most important barriers of attendance to have been during the first period of school lockdowns?
I think the first thing to be clear to the inquiry is that Ofsted still doesn't have access to live attendance data.
Yes.
We see census data once a year, but certainly during that time we didn't understand, who was attending schools. But it was very clear that there were problems, and it was one of fear and, as reported to me by my inspectors, conflicting messages that were, conflicted with central government, local authority, Public Health England. People were saying they really weren't sure, and so they took the line of least resistance, which was to not attend.
So one of the things, I don't think I need to take you to this, one of the things that you set out in your statement is that within each local area, schools differed considerably in the extent to which they were invited and critically encouraged pupils to attend school. This was the case both during and outside national lockdowns. For me, I think that's citing
Yes.
One of Ofsted's papers, but can I ask you about that then? Is it Ofsted's evidence that there is inconsistency of practice then?
Yes, it
across
absolutely is
England?
our evidence, and I think that the document, the extract you refer to, attempts to set that out really clearly.
And what that seems to be pinpointing was that it was up to individual schools, as it were, to be proactive about trying to get individual children into school.
Yes.
And that's what was producing inconsistency. Is that correct?
I think it's two-way. Schools are very, very good at dealing with children that have special educational needs, and then we look at the special educational needs system, and I think we've all concluded that this is a system in urgent need of reform. One of the problems here in this particular issue is that we were asking school leaders to enter into part of that system, engaging with local authorities, trying to get the support that they needed. So it could be a combination of the head teacher not doing that proactively enough, or indeed the head teacher doing it proactively and not getting the response that was required from the local authority.
And did Ofsted develop any understanding during the pandemic or since as to whether or not that was a problem? In other words, that there wasn't sufficiently good interaction or work as between local authorities and schools?
I think as the pandemic progressed, we became clearer and clearer, and whilst initially that catch-all of if there is a vulnerable child that needs to be educated, get into the system, we've been very clear there needs to be much more guidance around that, so that the rules are very clear. There was too much left to several parts of the system to really come together to make it happen. So we're clear, but it isn't an area that we've deeply researched. I know others have.
All right, I think that may be the point that's made at paragraph 681 of your statement, which is on page 291, if that helps. And this is the part of your statement that is considering child protection.
Yes.
And you set out there Having said that, although no formal data on this was collated or reported, it was clear that part of the difficulty facing child protection in the early stages of the pandemic was the significant debate and uncertainty over which children qualified as vulnerable children who should still be attending school. From a child protection perspective, it was not always clear which children were vulnerable. Is that really the point that you're making there? And obviously, you've said in that part of your statement at an early stage in the pandemic. So was that something that improved then over the course of time, that local authorities and schools came to have greater clarity as to who should be in school?
During the pandemic, I and my colleagues in Ofsted joined the Department for Education's, it's called REACT team. It was the DFE's regional directors that came together and met with mine and discussed an awful lot of data, looked at that attendance data that wasn't ours, but started to identify those local authorities that really were displaying signs of a higher degree of risk in this area, and that allowed discussions to take place with those local authorities about what additional support the DFE might be able to get them to help. So it was never perfect, but it started to improve because we were all looking at these different areas.
And is then the importance of that lesson that it was pointing out to some local authorities that they were lagging in terms of the numbers of vulnerable children that were attending school as compared to other local authorities? That was helpful, or something else?
No, I think it points out that it was helpful. I think it goes to a broader picture of reflection that whilst routine inspection was paused, we really fought hard. Amanda Spielman fought hard to get inspection started as quickly as possible, because that independent oversight and being able to report what is happening can have a really important impact, particularly in the middle of dealing with a crisis.
And can you help then in terms of what individual schools or head teachers may have done to encourage the families of vulnerable children to send them to school? Can you help with what may have worked? What is good practice, generally speaking, for trying to get those children in?
I think that everybody was concerned. Language was being used in a different context. Vulnerable became something that we all became familiar with. Clinically extremely vulnerable versus vulnerable definitions here. What really worked was where the communication between schools and parents, which is generally very good and well established, really set out very clearly expectations and support and listened carefully to parents and their anxieties. And we did a series of good practice guides, and they focused particularly on that communication and how important it is to listen to the concerns of parents.
One of the points that was made by the Children's Commissioner for England was that there was an issue around the framing of the policy insofar as it was orientated towards vulnerable children, and asking some families to send their children to school, but at the other time advising most other families that they shouldn't. Was that something that Ofsted picked up on at all or had concerns about?
It is, and Baroness Spielman spoke every opportunity about these concerns, the things that were really getting in the way, and the use of language and the confusion that was out there. And also in doing so, she took every opportunity, rightly, to say we need to get schools open as quickly as we possibly can to more and more pupils so that we can support them, because clearly this isn't working. And
is that also an important part of it? The more that you open up schools to more children, the better you can encourage the vulnerable children to come into school as well.
It's the confidence that you give parents that their next door neighbours' children are going to school, and that effect, that community effect, is really quite powerful. And it became, it was forced to become very disparate and isolated, and the school's job is being able to bring that community together, and so that's why we wanted to open schools to more and more children earlier.
And one of the other group of children who were eligible to attend school were those children who had the education, health and care plans as well. And what is set out in Ofsted's SEND report, reflecting on, I think, some of the barriers that children with those plans faced in going to school, was that the requirement that they undertake a risk assessment became a barrier. Is that correct? And is that Ofsted's assessment?
It's correct, but I think it was just another barrier in an area of confusion and fear, and then having to risk assess them. And actually looking at the plans that you'd put in place to support those children, I feel that schools reported to us they didn't feel supported and able to do that. And that's possibly why many of those children did not attend schools.
I mean, what you have set out in your statement, I won't take you to this, but it's at paragraph 383, was you set out a chart setting out the small number of children and young people who attended school from March to July 2020. And it sets out some parents, both of children with an EHC plan and those with SEND, but no EHC plan, told us their children had not been given any education at all. So can I just check what that means? Is that saying it's not just that those children didn't get to go to school, but that there was no appropriate provision for them in their homes as well on occasions?
Yes, that's exactly what it's saying.
And I understand this wasn't quantitative research. I think that's correct.
That's correct.
But was Ofsted able to assess whether or not this was a widespread problem or whether it was a more confined problem, or is it just not able to say?
I'm not able to say because routine inspections were paused, so we didn't have the access to children to schools in a way that we had previously done before. And that was a real problem to us. We didn't have access to attendance data. We just didn't have access to the information that we normally use to be able to determine the quality of provision of education, and that was taken away. What I think is clear, and you've seen from the statement, that despite that, we tried all of our best endeavours to ensure that we had as much oversight as we possibly could of those children that were most vulnerable. And if I can bring to your attention that during the pandemic, very quickly, we deployed 220 inspectors out to local authorities who, with a purpose specifically of being able to support as much as they could, but they were not inspectors at that time, that they were seconded into local authorities.
And so is it right then they are seconded to help with best practice,
yes,
to provide really practical advice?
Yes, it wasn't an accountability role that they undertook.
And was another part of the problem then at this stage that Ofsted just didn't have that much insight into the content of remote provision and what schools were actually able to provide at an early stage in the pandemic to children who were at home?
Yes, I mean, certainly in the first lockdown, there was no access whatsoever, and as we started our monitoring visits, we were visiting schools and talking about the arrangements, but at no point until much later on did we start to examine and think about the method that was being used to deliver remote education. And of course, what we did say very clearly is that there were no plans in place, and it became confused very, very quickly.
All right. Can I just move on to ask you, this is a different question. So we've talked about children who have those plans, whose needs are at a higher level. Obviously, children with special educational needs fell outside the specified categories of children who could attend school. but potentially those children could have been admitted to school under school's discretion. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And was Ofsted able to assess or get an idea as to whether or not children with those needs were able to attend school during the first set of lockdowns, or was it the case that most of those children were being educated at home as well?
I think the latter is true. What we didn't have is access to a robust evidence base that would allow us to answer that question beyond the anecdote of what we were hearing from professionals. But it is fair to say that those children did not attend school in big numbers.
One of the core participants has raised the question of whether Ofsted was aware of whether local authorities and schools risked assess children with special educational needs, but who didn't have a plan in order to determine if they should attend school. Is that something that Ofsted knows anything about?
I'm not able to comment on that.
All right. So I'm going to move on then, if I may, to ask you some questions about remote education. I want to be careful about language because the inquiry has heard some information or some evidence that remote education could mean the provision of worksheets or children being given physical work to do, as it were, at home, as opposed to being taught online.
Yes.
Is that right? Does that accord with Ofsted's understanding as well?
It does. I think there was confusion because there was a lack of guidance out there as to what remote education looked like. And actually, as we later on in October, we were publishing, as did the DFE, some good practice guides that said actually, a good remote education experience will have a mixture of worksheets that might test understanding and assessment, but also, the delivery of some lessons, etc. But it was very clear to say that in the outset, without any guidance, people didn't really understand what that language meant. And there was a scrabble to try and deliver something.
But presumably one of the real, well, let me ask you whether or not it was Ofsted's experience that at the start of the pandemic, there were just practical obstacles because of children's access to devices and the sorts of practical barriers there may have been to schools being able to provide online provision as opposed to physical provision.
I think that was recognised very early on, and in discussions that I had with the Department for Education, they were looking to deploy devices out to those that needed them. The devices themselves were not a problem because they were being donated by some very large corporate organisations. The issue was getting them out to children. And I did deploy one of my regional directors to a task force that would help to get these deployed, and he recounted to me at the time that he was very impressed by the army that had been sat around the table with the full logistical backing that's at their fingertips. And he came away, said, I feel really assured that this is going to be resolved. And then the army disappeared from the debate. I don't know why. And those devices then were deployed over to local authorities with everybody's best efforts to get them out to children. But subsequently, we've spoken to lots of schools and parents that said that they never did get their device that was going to be needed for them.
I'll come back, if I may, maybe to that point and just understanding what some of the barriers were. I just wanted to start first, though, with whether or not Ofsted became concerned about research or information that children were in fact not, and this is children who were able to access online education or remote education, whether Ofsted became concerned about the amount of time that children were spending on it.
We didn't scientifically or evidence precisely because we weren't able to have access, but by talking to schools themselves, they were very clear that the amount of time that children were, being able to be online was minimal. We were clear, the Chief Inspector was clear at the time, that whatever that time was, it really wasn't learning in its effective sense. Again, we need to get children back into school as possible, because at the very best, you're able to check that, you know, they are sat in front of a computer. But we heard the same stories that others did about, you know, this was not really an experience that was appropriate for so many children, because it's not just about the device, it's about the environment in which they live at. And I was particularly delighted to see, you know, your Children's Voices report that taught where those stories were brought to life about children actually not scrabbling for a device, scrabbling for a seat and a table to sit it on rather than being on the floor. And that was what people were dealing with at the time.
I am going to ask you about that and about the different barriers that children may have encountered. You have very helpfully at paragraph 238 of your statement, and that's at page 77, set out a long list of sources of information about remote access. But I had just wanted to ask you, if I can, about I, which is on page 79, and that refers to Ofsted's annual report that was published on the 1st of December 2020.
Yes.
And that sets out some of the issues. And if you go over the page to the end of that paragraph, and just to be accurate about this, that report referred to, if we looked at the first paragraph, that research suggested that children in England were spending 13 hours per week during lockdown on home learning. But one study by the Institute of Fiscal Studies suggested that the figure could be as low as 5 hours. That's at I.
Yes.
And then that report went on to cite a number of studies. That's at the very end of the paragraph on page 80.
Yes.
And it's in parenthesis, the study cited are 1, children doing 2.5 hours schoolwork a day on average. That was a study by University College London. Office for National Statistics data, July 2020, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies as well. So were those all sources that had been gathered and published at an earlier stage then that shone some light, albeit they seemed to say perhaps slightly different things about the amount of time that children were spending on education?
In the absence of the evidence that we would generally collect from our inspection programme, we were leaning into these research documents that were published by others to build the picture of concern that continued to draw attention to the need to get children back into education face-to-face as soon as possible.
So although those studies may give different figures, was the general consensus, or was it Ofsted's general assessment then that these supported, as you've put it, a picture of concern that children were not engaging in remote education in a way that they would have needed to in order to be able to either maintain or I suppose attain more in terms of their education?
Yes, the Chief Inspector and I at the time we gave evidence to the Education Select Committee to that effect, and the Chief Inspector gave several interviews talking about remote education at the very best being a sticking plaster.
Yes.
And needing to get back.
I'm going to, if I may, just come on to some of those broad observations. Before I do, though, I just wanted to come to another one of the bits of research that were done in and around the same time. This is INQ 000623810. So this is the National Foundation for Educational Research. And if we could just go to page 1, please. Sorry, page 3. This set out the findings that had been made about education that was being provided in April. Can you see the key findings? It may have come up on the screen in front of you.
Yes.
And if you just cast your eye over that, you'll see it states almost half of exam years, pupils in years 11 and 13, were not provided with work.
Yep.
And then just over half of all pupils taught remotely did not usually have any online lessons, defined as live or real-time lessons. Offline provision such as worksheets or video was much more common. And then if we could just skip down, that there was a division, I think, is that right, between secondary and primary pupils? And then that there was I think, a gap as well, as I understand what that research is saying, between pupils from higher income households as well, spending more time on education. But that, and I think it's the next bullet point, parents from the lowest income households spent the most amount of time supporting their child with schoolwork. And if we could just go over the page, please. This research was also, if we see the first bullet on the page, that 5% of pupils lived with an adult who was very high risk, so clinically extremely vulnerable, and that a further 19% lived with an adult who was at high risk. And then I think it makes the point underneath it that those pupils who were from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic background were more likely to live with an at-risk adult. Thank you, that can come down. May I ask, does that research, again, does that generally accord with what Ofsted's understanding of the position would have been at around the time this was published?
Yes, it does.
In summer 2020. And that research was obviously specifically pointing to the fact that there was potentially large numbers of children who were living in clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable households. Was that an issue that was on Ofsted's radar as a matter of concern, or as a group of children who might need to be given distinct consideration?
I mean, throughout and in my witnessed statement, you know, we were concerned about these children all the way through. Our role during the pandemic was to be the critical friend to the policymakers, to say, but what about these children? I worked very closely with my social care colleagues in Ofsted, who spent an awful lot of time saying, but what about the clinically extremely vulnerable children? And we were concerned that, you know, there was not enough thought going into, you know, children within those families, and that was the role that we played.
All right, and maybe was that a concern that became more prominent when children were going back to school in September, or was that just a general concern?
A general continuation. We talked about it right from the outset. We were most worried about these children in these circumstances, but of course, as the infection itself, you know, changed and new strains and whatever, it again became an ongoing problem about these children.
We'll maybe touch on that again later, but just staying with the provision of remote education, I think what you've suggested just a few moments ago was that the overall assessment was it served as a sticking plaster. Was that Ofsted's overall assessment as to what remote education could achieve during periods of school closure?
Yes, that's true. There is no replacement for face-to-face interaction between a teacher and a child. But we accepted that in the circumstances that we're in, you know, it was a sticking plaster response. And
again, I don't think I need to take you to it, but in the remote education research paper that Ofsted produced, it highlighted that there was an issue of assessing remote attendance as opposed to remote learning, and the distinction between those two things. Can I just ask you to explain that, please?
Yes, I think as I referred a moment or two ago, at the very best, we were checking that children were there and were sat in front of a computer, but the interaction, the engagement that particularly younger children would get from being in a school setting was not there, and actually, being able to check that learning has been understood and giving children the opportunity to ask questions, and as a teacher being able to assess that all of those things have happened before you moved on was not possible through a remote learning package. So that's exactly what I meant by it.
One of the issues that your evidence highlights, and this came, I think, as I understand your evidence from parents, was that they identified quite early on that motivation was a problem, trying to get children to stay engaged. Did it develop an understanding as to what helped children to stay engaged online, or what helped to produce the best engagement with remote learning?
We did that. Both the Department for Education and Ofsted later produced good practice guides based on what we had seen and how it had worked very, very well in the past. But we definitely didn't have a template of how you go and do it. And I know that the Department for Education has since sent out more guidance, non-statutory guidance, that shows the available resources to schools to be able to pull together the ARC Academy, etc. The Oak Academy, I'm sorry, and being able to pull together a package that was better than what happened in the first wave of the pandemic.
Yes, because I think that's an important point to ask you, is whether or not Ofsted considered that provision improved in the second set of school closures, and whether it knows whether that led to better engagement on the part of more children.
I think on the point of better engagement, that was always very difficult because we didn't have access to any data that would be helpful to assess that point. But definitely through our monitoring visits, where we engaged with teachers and people were becoming much better informed about what was working from their perspective, and of course they were talking to their children as well. They were all able to articulate that we've moved on an awful long distance in a very short space of time, but that's not surprising because the school education sector are very flexible and fleet of foot, and here was a really good example of how they started from zero and very quickly started to develop things that were working well, better.
You've mentioned the Children and Young People's Voices report, and that obviously provides an insight into children, I think, finding it difficult to engage, and there being lots of other interesting things on the internet or games to play whenever you should be, in theory, attending online school. Are those sorts of voices, and is that sort of information gathered by Ofsted or available to policymakers in order to be able to really challenge the sorts of things that you actually have to grapple with if you want children to learn online?
As an inspector myself, my career has been about engaging with pupils and young adults about their experiences of their education. So often that's a key plank of what inspection does. I think a lesson learned for Ofsted, through the pandemic is looking to find ways to better engage with those pupils, those service users, and we're soon to be. We've been doing some work to look at that, but we haven't got a body of evidence other than through the great work of the product that we just talked about there.
All right. I'm going to move on, if I may, to deal then with a different issue, which is about children's differential experiences, which I think is something that you just touched upon a little while ago. So that you in the course of your evidence have mentioned access to devices as one issue, engagement as another. But I think what you were about to touch on, but I stopped you, was that children's home environments as well also, I think, play an important part, is what you suggest in your evidence, in their ability to engage with education at home too.
Well, there's two elements to that I think come across in the statement. There's the ability to engage in education, but I think, very quickly on, many more people than the likes of us that work in Ofsted recognise the valuably important role that schools play as part of the keeping children safe arrangements. Being able to report on what they're seeing because they see these children every day was taken away. So I think there are a number of factors to this, but most definitely preventing them from being able to come to school or having access to devices was dependent on a huge range of factors.
But just focusing, if I may, on being educated in the home and the sorts of barriers that children may have faced at home in accessing education. What was Ofsted's assessment as to the things that were important in that respect?
Yes, space and support and lack of distraction. You've mentioned the fact that we scrabbled to give electronic devices to children for a particular purpose, but as your own research demonstrates, children very easily get distracted into doing other things with them. But space, a lot of us would conceive our living arrangements as being in a number of rooms and how many bedrooms or whatever. We're talking about a lot of children here with living in very close confined space, so absolutely no space and no ability to concentrate on what one was listening to because the household continues.
One of the things that we haven't touched on yet with any witness, but maybe you might know something about this, Mr. Coffey, is one of the things highlighted is parental support as well, and the availability of parental support to help children with remote education. Was that something that Ofsted considered was also a factor?
I think it was a huge factor, particularly for younger children that needed that parental support and engagement. I'm sure we all saw the same news, bulletins with people exhausted, having spent time what they would consider teaching their children. So there needed to be that support in order to help those children. So the differentials would come on that level. Older children were a bit more motivated, maybe needed a bit less supervision, but maybe more easily distracted onto things other than their education.
I want to move on then, if I may, just to ask you about some of the consequences or the impacts that school closures had for children. And I wanted to ask you, really, I'll come to long-term impacts, but if I can start maybe with the picture that started to emerge in the autumn of 2020, what groups of children were Ofsted most concerned about after that period of disruption?
The children that we knew we were worried about, clearly the vulnerable children, those with special educational needs, and education and healthcare plans for sure, but also the children that we didn't know we were worried about because they weren't, in view of nobody had eyes on. We use the term eyes on a lot to really define, is there a professional agency or body that is able to see these children? And that was something that we were deeply concerned about, hence the wanting to deploy our own staff to do as much as we possibly could without, knocking on doors of children, but supporting those whose job it might be to go and do that.
And what about the children who had missed the transition period? So children who might have transitioned to primary school and children who might have transitioned to secondary school. Did they emerge as cohorts of particular concern?
Well, they did at the time, but maybe that became more obvious to us as children started to come back to school. When schools were reopening, particularly at those transition points, they were, they'd missed out on that really important preparation stage, and there they were. And maybe, maybe that has led into greater anxiety about engaging back into education. But you asked me about the kind of first phases of the pandemic response. So
Yes.
they were all areas of great concern to us, but some of them did reveal themselves a little bit later on.
And just, this is a very general question, but in terms of when schools went back in September, what was Ofsted's index of concern about the extent to which there had been learning loss during that period between March and September 2020?
Well, it was huge, our index of concern. We were just, really worried about how that lost learning would manifest itself, how schools would start to understand that better. We were concerned that we might take a whole school, whole class approach to lost learning, when actually what was really needed was the individual assessment of what children had lost for the reasons that we've just talked about, and everyone's circumstance being different. So they're the things that we were worried about as children started to come back. But would they come back was, probably a bigger question.
And was Ofsted involved in helping the government or providing support to the government in terms of the reopening of school in September 2020?
I do remember that in a meeting that I had with colleagues across government, the Department for Education was starting to articulate its plans for the reopening, and I offered that Ofsted would critique those for them as a critical friend, and we did that, and I believe that that's in the witness evidence. We didn't pull any punches. We said we don't think that this really focuses sufficiently on all of those children we really should be worried about. No one's talking about transport. Taxis for children with special educational needs are just not running, and so we were worried about a whole number of things. And I was delighted that they invited us to give that assessment.
And was Ofsted then, having been invited to the table, was it content then that its concerns or that its insights had been listened to and that they were acted on in advance of schools opening?
Well, we were delighted to have been invited because that's something that we were pushing. We started this session talking about how we could use our expertise, and here's a really good example of where we did that. We're not the policy makers, that's the Department for Education, and we sent it in and they acknowledged with great thanks. I'm sure it went through lots of other iterations, but we didn't keep a daily record or a log of what was happening with it.
All right. I want to move on, if I may, just to talk about, or to ask you about what Ofsted assesses the long-term impacts of the pandemic to have been on children and young people. And I wonder if I could just take each of the headlines really from your statement and ask you a bit more about them. So I think the first headline is attendance, is that correct?
That's correct.
And what's Ofsted's assessment as to the impact on attendance?
So we're deeply concerned about the persistent absence. So those children that repeatedly don't attend, and when you start to examine the DFE's data in that way, you start to identify that it is children with special educational needs that are much more likely to fail to attend and persistently fail to attend. It's a relatively small number, but a huge problem, and I think we're very, very worried about that. Our new inspection framework, therefore, for that reason, focuses an awful lot more on attendance issues, but it is very clear to see that there are a smaller number of persistent absences that we need to be concerned about why that might be.
And is that an issue that Ofsted links to the pandemic or not?
I don't think that we've got fulsome evidence to support it, but I, as an inspector, and given all that we've examined and all of the anxiety that sits around that particular group of children, I think it's likely that there is a clear link.
And is that linked to your evidence about the pandemic having in some way changed the relationship between families and schools?
I think
or
so.
changed, or that something has shifted in the culture
Yeah,
that sits between schools and families?
I think that's right. That social contract, and you know, certainly as long as I was ever at school and working life, it's just a foundation of everything that you do that children go to school. That's it. It's compulsory education. We talk about those terms an awful lot. I think that's been challenged since the pandemic. I think there's less of a adherence to that fundamental. So I think when people talk about the breakdown of the social contract, that's what they talk about. I've certainly observed it from our point of view because people can complain to Ofsted about schools, and I've seen an increase in the complaints that come to Ofsted. I think, we were talking about 15,000 complaints a year that have gradually gone up, and we're about 17,500 since the pandemic. They're complaints to Ofsted about an individual school each year. Now, we don't rush off and go and inspect the school on that behalf. Very small numbers that we'd actually inspect as a result of that. But I think it demonstrates that people are much more likely to challenge because of the fear and anxiety that they have themselves. And so that's how I would conclude the challenges that we're seeing.
Another point that you draw out in your statement is the increase in the number of children who are now electively home educated since the pandemic. And I think, I'm not going to turn it up, I think your evidence is that the numbers have doubled. Is that correct?
Yes, I'd need to be careful about a direct correlation of doubling. I think this is an area that we've been really, really concerned about for a good number of years. And I think our concerns have been listened to in a number of ways. There is a bill going through the Children Wellbeing and Schools Act through Parliament at the moment that says that there will be a register of these children. This is very, very welcome. The other thing that's happened is that the Department for Education now mandates the collection of that data, whereas previously it wasn't mandated and it was collected by the Association of Directors of Children's Services. But there's 111,000 children today that are, or in the last briefing from the DFE, census day, who were being electively home educated. And I've got to say right from the outset, some of those children will be in a brilliant environment, being exceptionally well educated. Our concern is for those that don't fit into that category. And we're really worried about them. And I would really recommend the inquiry consider that, as that passage of the legislation through Parliament emerges, where it's the local authority will have to maintain that register, I'm keen to know how regulators like me will have access to it.
Right. So I think, is that the issue then that's perhaps of concern, that this information may be collected, but there's an issue as to who will have access to it? Yes,
because we are so worried about, off-rolling and all of those issues. People are not often well equipped to be able to educate their children at home, as we found out through the pandemic. And so if that is seen as being a viable option that we encourage, then we really need to be able to look into this in a great deal more depth.
And I just want to touch, if I may please, on two of your other headlines.
Yes.
I think the other headline is the disadvantage gap, and where it now stands post-pandemic. Is that the other headline point?
Yes, and the disadvantage gap, is starting to, or is continue to increase. It's something that we need to keep a really close eye on. It will be linked, I'm sure, to attendance issues that we've just talked about, yes. But we've got to keep a really, close eye on it. And again, our new framework for inspection in schools really focuses on inclusion, and the principle that we spoke about earlier, that the head teacher is really the person that knows very well who their vulnerable children are.
And then I think the other issue that you have highlighted of particular concern is the position of children with special educational needs as well. Is that correct?
Yes. And I think that's a theme that has run through the witness statement and this module within the inquiry.
And may I ask you, Mr. Cuffey, one of the issues posited in your statement is the concern that some of the children who are now being described as having special educational needs, that might be, as it were, a leftover from the pandemic, that they are behind in their education but have been said to have special educational needs. Is that a concern that has persisted, or is that something that Ofsted has more insight into now?
But we don't have the insight, we don't have the evidence for that. The former Chief Inspector, Baroness Spielman, cautioned that as we came out of the pandemic on a road to recovery, that we must give time for, the catch-up to happen before jumping to establishing that a child has got special educational needs, because actually they just might have lost learning and need to be caught up. So there was a caution there. And there was also a caution that she offered that actually, because of the system, the special educational needs system being frustrating for a lot of parents that enter into it, she was concerned that they would reach a point of frustration that they would choose to go and electively home educate their children. So there's some cautionary notes about them, but they are very, very important topics that we need to continue to focus.
And just very shortly, is one of the issues that Ofsted is concerned about the impact that it had on children not being able to access services or therapies or special provision during the period of the pandemic.
Absolutely, and I think that vicious circle of, being at home but having those additional needs that weren't being met by those services, and then that adding to a concern, about going back into school, being further behind than your peers. So, it really is a difficult situation.
Can I just ask, did Ofsted have any role during the pandemic in monitoring, for example, what local authorities were doing with the relaxations that had been provided to them in terms of their statutory duties? For example, the statutory duty to meet the requirements of an education health and care plan.
Yes, we did fulfil that role through monitoring. We didn't audit the requirements that were placed, but actually on that particular issue about the expectation of being able to provide education, we did look at those, and I would Dorset is a good example of a monitoring visit that we undertook that explored those very themes, and we did that throughout.
And can I just check, was that monitoring then through those inspections rather than being charged with a role to monitor what every local authority was doing?
That's right. It was through those inspection visits.
I'm grateful. I'm going to move on, if I may. Just to check, please, just some of the evidence that you have provided about safeguarding whenever schools returned, or the issue of safeguarding over the duration of the pandemic. And I think that what you've said, and it's at paragraph 428, if you need it, is about the experience of schools whenever schools returned. Were you able to find that in your statement?
Yes, I've got that.
It's at page 158. The experience of schools whenever they went back in terms of having an increased rate of children reporting about things that had happened at home. And I just wondered if I could ask you a bit about that. That seems to suggest that there was an increase in children reporting to schools that they had experienced potentially harmful experiences at home, but particularly domestic abuse. And I just wondered if I could ask you a bit more about Ofsted's assessment of that.
Yeah, I think we assess this in a number of different ways. In my evidence, I've presented that we were concerned about the number of serious incident briefings that we were we were seeing that were briefings undertaken by the local authority. This is generally to the very youngest children. So we had some safeguarding concerns there. We constantly expressed our concern that we weren't seeing children, but clearly at that paragraph, when children did start to come back to school, that was the moment when the teachers were able to have some independent eyes and refer children back through into the system. Throughout the evidence, we did actually anticipate that being a higher number, but you might hypothesise that those children that were in the worst positions possible might have been kept away for even longer. So we were concerned that there needed to be a continued effort to ensure that those children that were not appearing on the school roll, we needed to make sure that we were getting out to see them, that schools were getting out to see them.
And then just picking up your statement at paragraph 670C, so deep into your statement, you also set out some concerns that Ofsted had, let me find the page for Mr. Coffey, some concerns that Ofsted had about local authority strategy in general, coming into the autumn of 2020 as well. Is that correct? You should have that at page 285.
Could you give me the paragraph number again, please?
Yes, it's 670C, and it was picking up on your briefing from the autumn of 2020. And I think you've set out there from A to E some of the issues that local authorities were experiencing.
Yes, I think it talks to an awful lot. Whilst we might have looked at this from a social care lens, it does talk to an awful lot of the evidence that we've discussed already. Those services that children in school that would normally receive as part of their special educational needs provision, and that may well be child and adolescent mental health services, but particularly prevalent for this group of looked after children, those services were not as readily available and have continued to be challenged since the pandemic. But it was particularly an issue for these children that were looked after, that those services weren't available to them.
All right, Mr. Coffey, if I can just ask you to wait there, please, my lady. I think there's a question from a core participant.
There is Mr. Broach.
My lady, thank you. Mr. Coffey, I represent the children's rights organisations. And in your evidence earlier, you said that independent oversight can have a really important impact, particularly in the middle of dealing with a crisis. However, in March 2020, inspections of secure training centres, or STCs, were suspended. For youth offending institutes, some oversight continued in the form of short scrutiny visits. But from March 2020 until September 2020, there was a complete lack of oversight over the treatment conditions and rights of children in STCs. At the time, there were two STCs, Oak Hill and Rainsbrook. When Ofsted carried out monitoring visits to Rainsbrook STC in October and December 2020, you found that children were still being locked in their cells for 23.5 hours a day and invoked the urgent notification process. Did Ofsted consider the impact of suspending visits on these vulnerable children at a time they faced unprecedented restrictions on their rights?
My lady, I think the question almost answers itself in the urgent notification process had never previously been administered for this particular group of children. So whilst I accept that the normal inspection arrangements were suspended, what we were able to put in place, which was inspectors going on the ground to be able to see what was happening to children, had not diminished our ability to be able to express in the starkest terms our dissatisfaction, our shock actually, about what was happening to those children in that particular establishment. So we maintained oversight of these children, albeit under a slightly different title, but it was very clearly holding to account. And I know my inspectors were very shocked about what they were seeing here, and I'm equally proud of the work that they did throughout this very difficult period.
My lady, may I ask a short follow-up?
You may.
I'm grateful. Mr. Coffey, our understanding is that there was no oversight in STCs for the period from March 2020 until September 2020. There was some oversight in YOIs, but nothing in STCs. Is that right? And if so, do you accept that some alternative approach which allowed for some oversight ought to have continued?
My lady, if I could come back to the inquiry on the specific dates of that period that was referenced, it's absolutely right that we didn't monitor until September, and we very quickly went out to where we were, but I'd really like to be able to set out what we did do during that period to continually assure ourselves as best as we possibly could in the circumstances.
I'm grateful, my lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Broach. Mr. Coffey, thank you very much. By the sounds of it, you've still got a little bit more help to give us because you've just volunteered to provide a bit more information. But thank you for the help you've given to date and for the help that your colleagues have provided to the inquiry.
Thank you.
Very well. I shall break now and I shall return at midday.
Grateful, my lady. My lady, the next witness is Sir John Coles.
Thank you, Mr. Owen.
Thank you. I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Yeah, John Coles.
Sir John, I think you have in front of you a statement which bears the number INQ 000651602.
That's right.
And it's a statement that comprises 83 pages.
Yep.
And can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
So, John, I think it's right that you've been the Chief Executive of United Learning since January 2012.
That's right.
And that's a large multi-academy trust, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And we also run independent schools, so we're unusual in that way.
I'm going to come back to how unusual you are, but if I just deal with some basics, prior to you becoming Chief Executive, I think it's correct that you in fact worked at the Department for Education for a considerable period of time.
That's right, for about 15 years.
And I think it's also right that during the last 4 years of your civil service career, you were in fact a member of the Department for Education board. Is that right?
I was, yes.
And does that denote that you were a very senior civil servant?
Yes, I was Director General for Schools and then Education Standards.
And just then coming to the role that you played during the pandemic, so aside being the Chief Executive of United Learning, I think that it's correct that from April 2020 until March 2022, you were a member of the Department for Education's Recovery Advisory Group. Is that correct?
That's right.
I'll come back to that. And we'll also see that in your role as the Chief Executive of United Learning, but also I think on behalf of the Confederation of School Trusts, you also made representations to the Department for Education and Ofqual about the way that children should be assessed because examinations couldn't take place.
Yes.
And you were also involved in the Oak National Academy as well, but principally because United Learning were a, I think, very significant contributor to the work of Oak. Is that right?
That's right. We produced a large number of lessons for Oak. I was also then on the oversight board of Oak.
All right. And then just going back, if I may, to your Academy Trust, does that comprise about 87 different schools?
Yeah, so we're over 100 now, but at the time, around that number, yes.
And I think those schools are in fact dotted across the country, apart from the northeast at the time of the pandemic. Is that right?
That's right. So we run the length of the country, so from Carlisle in the north right down to the south coast, not further east than Cambridge, not in the far northeast, not at the time really in the southwest, but a very national picture. And in terms of the main regions of the country, I think it was only the northeast that we weren't in at that time.
And I think, are most of those schools non-selective schools?
That's right. So typically they are schools which we've taken on because they got into difficulty and are often in areas of deprivation, not exclusively, but mostly in areas of deprivation, having a history of not having been successful, and almost all are non-selective schools.
But on the other hand, you also have some independent schools within your group as well.
That's right. So that was our historic foundation back from the 19th century. We were founded as a group of schools for girls at a time when it was understood that finally that the lack of education for girls and young women was a serious social problem. So that was our original foundation. We still have around a dozen of those independent schools in the group.
All right, I'll come back to the oversight that afforded you as to the challenges in different parts of the school system. But just bringing this to a close in terms of the composition of your schools, I think that in total at the time of the pandemic, that meant you had just about 57,500 children in the schools. Is that right?
That's right.
And in fact, in terms of eligibility for free school meals, that stood at about 24% of your children.
That's right, yes.
And I think that's slightly higher than the national figure at that time.
That's right, yes.
And I think in terms of children with special educational needs, that stood at around 16% of your children.
That's right.
And then about 28% of your children had English as an additional language. Is
Yes.
that also right? The inquiry will hear evidence this week from some head teachers or school leaders from schools that aren't in multi-academy trusts from different parts of the United Kingdom. Could you just explain to the chair, during the pandemic, the benefits that being in a big trust afforded the schools in your group?
Yes, so I'd probably say there are three types of benefit, really. One is capability, one is capacity, and one is the network. So as a large multi-academy trust, we have a central office, and having a central office means that we've got some more specialist skills than a single school could have afforded. So, for example, we have a safeguarding lead who is, a fully professional safeguarding lead and has no other role, and a small safeguarding team. We have a health and safety lead who is a fully professional health and safety expert and so on. So we have these people with particular skill sets, obviously I could go on, which aren't typically found to that level in individual schools. That meant that, for example, as we headed towards closure in the week of the 13th and onwards of October, we were issuing quite specialist guidance to schools about handling health and safety, about handling safeguarding incidents, about their responsibilities through what was heading our way, about HR as well, for example, and about continuity of learning. So, we had specialists who were able to give that kind of advice.
I'm just going to stop you there. You said from the 13th of October. I think you probably meant the 13th of March.
Yes, I'm sorry, I keep doing this. The 13th of March, thank you, 2020.
So that's one of the economies of scale, is concentration of specialists at the centre. And you said there were three.
Yeah, and so the second is sort of capacity. So we had more ability, I think, just in terms of volume of skills and specialists at the centre to take on a range of issues, get ahead of them, provide advice to schools, make sure that the heads were simply told, if you do it this way, it'll be fine. And so heads didn't have to think about all of those kinds of issues. And then the network benefit, I think, is another example. So again, taking you back to that week of the 13th of March 2020, we were able not only to say to schools, right, we want your closure plan submitted to us by the 13th, for whenever that comes, we were able to give them an awful lot of specialist support, but also to give them examples from other schools of here's a plan that somebody else has produced, here's the best example of this issue being tackled well in schools. And so that benefit of being a big network of 10,000 adults and 50-odd thousand children and young people meant that we could rapidly share learning across the trust. So I think if you took those benefits together of capacity, capability, and the wider network, it meant that we were just able to provide much faster, much more comprehensive, much more expert support to our schools than we were seeing happen in much of the rest of the country, where schools might be in a very small trust, where they were collaborating well, but they just didn't have central capacity in that way, or in local authority maintained schools in an awful lot of local authorities where the ability of that authority to support schools had declined very sharply over the previous sort of 10 years, partly because lots of schools had left local authorities and joined trusts, but partly also because of budget cuts to local authorities and so on. So it became very obvious to us at the centre, and particularly to our heads, that they were just getting a very different level of support from United Learning than their neighbouring schools and colleagues were getting. And often, our heads and we generally were trying to be as generous as possible in sharing advice and, making sure that, templates or, detailed advice about how to do things was just being shared with other people who wanted it, but obviously communicating constantly with our heads.
I'm sure we'll come back to this, but in the course of that answer, you've talked about what you were providing to schools in the lead up to the 18th of March. Were you doing that because you had been given information by government or given a steer by government that you should be doing that? Or was that something you initiated yourself?
No, that was something we initiated ourselves. So from early March, we were starting to meet and discuss COVID as a specific, big, discrete issue, starting to communicate in a dedicated way with our schools about COVID and the handling of it. From the 10th of March onwards, we were starting to communicate really on a daily basis about what things we could see coming down the track. And, on the 10th, 11th of March, we were saying to schools, look, we can see that schools are going to close in the near future. And I don't think that was based on anything other than common sense, really, and an appreciation of what was coming.
Forgive me for interrupting you. I think you may be speaking a little too fast.
Oh,
I think, in fact,
apologise.
you've slowed down slightly. But maybe if we can just keep an eye on that. I think you're in the middle of a very important point, so I'm sorry to have interrupted you. But I think what you're saying is it was apparent to you schools would close, so
yes.
you, as it were, got on with providing.
That's right. And we could see that there were some issues that schools were starting to face, children, increasingly having to self-isolate, in a couple of cases, numbers of staff having to self-isolate. And so we were giving HR advice to schools about how to handle the things that were coming. And we were giving safeguarding advice because we could see that the question of how to handle safeguarding issues was going to be different in the future. We started giving continuity of learning advice. And in that week, we started running webinars for our schools on how to provide remote education. We went back to the department in that week on the 13th of March and asked the question, what will you be doing about children on free school meals, and will it be okay for, will you be supporting people to provide vouchers in place of the free school meal, because that seems like the obvious solution to that problem. And yes, all of that was self-initiated. It wasn't directed from outside the department, from outside the organisation by the department. And it was obviously in part us also listening carefully to heads and hearing their questions. And as we asked them to plan, looking to support their planning, but also looking to make sure we were responding to issues as they were coming up from schools. And I guess we just, as I think was correct, considered it to be our job to plan for something that looked to be a likely risk.
And was there any sort of steer like that coming from government that you were aware of being provided to local authorities, for example, or any sort of steer, this is what schools should be doing now, or?
No, so in terms of preparation for closure, I mean, to be honest, I've read in Gavin Williamson's statement that he says that the department hadn't done any planning by this point for school closure because their priority was keeping schools open. I almost fell off my chair when I read that. I think that's an extraordinary dereliction of duty by the leadership of the department, both political and civil service. It was perfectly clear to me, as just somebody who was running schools, that there was a high likelihood that schools would have to close, and we were planning for that, whilst also, of course, doing everything we could to keep schools open. But we had received no direction, as apparently the Department for Education was waiting for a direction from Number 10 before it started its planning work. We had received no direction, and we got on with planning because that's obviously the right thing to do in the circumstances.
So, John, I'm going to move on then to ask you some questions about examinations. I'm going to come at the end of your evidence to ask you more about what happened in your schools, but I want to start with asking you about your insight into government decision making and then return perhaps to the more granular picture. I think it's right that when the closure of schools was announced on the 18th of March, it was also announced that secondary school examinations wouldn't be going ahead. And I assume to you it became apparent at that point that some sort of equivalent approach to assessment would have to be taken.
Yeah. So I was surprised, and I expressed that surprise to our heads on the 18th when exams were cancelled. And although we'd been preparing for schools to close, there'd been strong messaging about exams carrying on right up until that point. And obviously, the decision to cancel exams strongly signalled to us that the period of school closure was likely to be long. So from the 18th onwards, I started to express some concern about what the department was doing. By the 20th, I said to our heads, I wasn't reassured by what I was hearing about how this was going to be done. And on the 22nd, I said I thought it sounded unsatisfactory, and I contacted Andrew McCulley, the Director General of Schools, effectively my successor in the department, to say, to offer support in thinking about exams. So very early that became a worry.
And I think it's right, before I go any further, that you do have experience in the field of examinations. It is something that you know something about.
Yeah. So, and I'll try not to be too technical. I'm conscious that it's very easy to plunge into lots of detail in this. But yes, I was the director responsible for qualifications in the department for 3 years. So I had oversight of GCSE and A-level in that time. I was responsible for our relationship with the then QCA. And, my team and I were responsible for setting up Ofqual and taking it out of QCA whilst I was in that.
So I think that's
role.
all. Sorry, forgive me. I didn't mean to cut across you. Just wanted to ask you to pause. So you weren't coming at this issue just from the perspective of a concerned chief executive of a big trust. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I think it was. I mean, all the people in the department and Ofqual were fully aware of that background as well. So when I was talking to them, obviously I was talking to them in a professional capacity in my current role, but also as somebody who had done these jobs in the past and worked with a number of them on these issues.
And I think what happened was that there was a consultation about the potential way forward for replacing examination grades, and a model was proposed as to how an assessment would be arrived at for children who couldn't sit their GCSE or A-level examinations. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And when you saw that model, and I think this was in and around the 28th of April 2020, did you have concerns about it?
Yes, so I had concerns actually before the draft guidance for consultation was published. So I attended a meeting on the 27th of March on behalf of the Confederation of School Trusts with Ofqual, which was a stakeholder meeting they were having, and probed a little bit what they were thinking and expressed some concern back to colleagues in CST about what they were proposing. And when the Ofqual consultation document was produced on the 3rd of April, I quite quickly felt that what they were proposing was, just what I was worried about, really. And so started writing a paper then by mid-April to respond to that consultation on behalf of the wider group of trusts.
And I'm going to ask you, please, if you can explain in language that people who are not experts in this field, which obviously includes me, will understand about what your concern was about the model that was being proposed as to how these children would be assessed.
I'll do my best. So sort of taking a step back, the big issue, I think, is that it didn't take sufficient account of fairness to individual young people. That's the core issue. It prioritised the need to avoid grade inflation at a national level, which is in any normal year a hugely important thing in my view. And obviously, having been involved in setting up Ofqual, I would think that, for a range of reasons we can obviously discuss. In this year, though, the position we put forward as a CST was there has to be some leniency. You have to allow there to be some grade inflation in this year in order to avoid unfairness to individual young people. And fundamentally, the reason for that is completely non-technical. It is that we're in March and April 2020. They've stopped going to school in March 2020. Exams don't happen until May and June 2020, and the future is not fixed. We can't know how well each individual child is going to do. If they work really hard between March and May, and if they get a paper which falls well for them, they'll do better than if they don't work very hard in the next 2 weeks and the paper doesn't fall well for them. So it's reasonable for teachers to think, well, this child would get a B on a good day, but might only get a C on a less good day, might even only get a D if it went badly. So that's the sort of fundamental point. Lots of young people will be uncertain in this sort of wide range, sometimes wide range. And yet, this is a hugely consequential thing for them. So if they drop a grade at GCSE, it might mean they can't get into the sixth form or do the apprenticeship that they want to do. They might have to retake an English or maths GCSE. At A-level, they might not get into their first choice university. The only way to make sure that there's no grade inflation nationally is to take a harsh view of lots of those borderline cases, and in the end, to overgrade quite a lot of children and undergrade an equally large number of children in a way that preserves the national distribution but is not fair to individuals. If I could try as untechnically as I can to turn to this idea of an algorithm, which became central to this debate.
So I think we might need to lay a foundation before we go on. So the model that was proposed incorporated an algorithm that would have, if you want to explain the impact it would have. So let me start with something really basic. Would a teacher assess a child and say, I think this child will get a C, and the algorithm would moderate that, or was a different approach being proposed?
So for all, a different approach, really. So all teachers were asked to say what grade would the young person have got, but they were also asked to produce a rank order across their school of who was the highest achieving, who was the lowest achieving, everybody ranked in order. And then what this model did was essentially predict for every school, if we're talking about A-level, how many would have got an A, how many would have got an A star, how many would have got a B, and so on, based only on historic data. So how well did children in this school normally do adjusted a little bit for the prior attainment of the young people. So if in this school, on average across recent history with a bit of adjustment, 5 would have got an A star, 6 would have got an A, 7 would have got a B, and so on. Then what the Ofqual proposal was that we would then we would produce that model, say how many grades each school gets, and then we take the rank order that the school's given us, and we'd give the first 5 in this example an A star, the next 6 an A, the next 7 a B, and so on. So that's how it was decided. So effectively, the grades that teachers had given in most cases were simply discarded, and this model was put in place using the rank order and the historic information about school performance. Now, the thing about this is that could only conceivably be a fair thing to do if the results of individual schools are quite stable over time. If you can accurately say, well, yes, there would have been 5 A stars in this school, that's right. Always are, always will be. That isn't right, isn't true. And the paper that I sent to Ofqual in the end uses their own data from their own website just to point out to them that it isn't true. There are very wide variations from year to year, just ordinarily, in the number of children getting an A star or an A, or at GCSE a 7 or a 5 or a 4. Right across the country, it's perfectly normal for there to be quite a number of schools where there's a 10 percentage point swing from one year to the next. Some are up, some are down. And the thing is, you can't tell in advance which is going to be which. And the model discards the fact that there is that year-to-year randomness of the 10-point swing either way. And so, there'll be schools where you would get a 5 pupil increase in the number of A's, let's say, and there'll be schools where you get a 5 percentage point decrease. The model discards all of that and gives them all the modelled number and treats the modelled number as if it's right, and the people who would have added 5 as overgrading and the people who would have taken away 5 as undergrading, even though they could be perfectly accurate in what they're saying, leaving aside obviously the fact that we can't really know, even at the individual level. So this means that later on there became a lot of discussion about outliers. And it is true that there was a particularly acute issue where, for example, if a school historically had always had 2 children getting a U and 2 children getting an E, the model would tell them that their bottom 2 were getting a U and their next bottom 2 were getting an E, even if, in this unusual year, all of them were going to get a B or a C or better. In other words, all of them were performing very highly. So you got these particularly acute outlying examples where, young people were dropping 3 or 4 grades from where everybody would have expected them to be. But that isn't actually the biggest issue. The biggest issue is that even on Ofqual's own estimation after the fact, only 60% of modelled grades would have been correct, which is to say 40% of grades would have been wrong on average across the system. That is, at GCSE, 2 million grades would have been wrong. And that was a known fact by Ofqual on the day that they wanted to go ahead with this model. 1 million would have been overgraded and 1 million would have been undergraded, roughly speaking. So we'd have had a nationally representative distribution, but at the cost of millions of grades being incorrect. Now, sorry to go on. If you were a young person doing 10 GCSEs on this basis, the chances that if all of those GCSEs are independently 60% likely to be correct, the chance that all 10 are correct is 0.6%. In other words, 99.4% of children across the country, on Ofqual's own data, would have been given at least 1 incorrect grade. Now, I thought that was profoundly unfair because these things are consequential for children and young people.
I'm going to come back and ask you about the consequences because I think that's something we're interested, it's important to get out what the consequences were.
Yeah.
I just want, before we get there though, I just want to understand a bit more about your attempts to try and persuade other people that this might be a problem. So first of all, I don't, you didn't have any difficulty, did you, in being able to access and speak to people in Ofqual or government about this, did you?
No, and I mean, one of the very frustrating things was it seemed like we were having really good conversations in which they were understanding the issues and taking them away and wanting to do something about it. So I wrote this paper. We submitted it as a Confederation of School Trusts joint paper on the 28th of April and asked the director responsible in Ofqual for a meeting. He responded on the 30th of April. At the same time, we copied it to DFE officials and to the minister. And whilst the minister said, or the minister's office said, look, he's got an awful lot on, but I'll make sure he's aware, we actually had a rapid response from the DFE director responsible.
Let me help you. I think we get to the point, I think, Sir John, where you wrote a letter, and let me bring it up on screen so that you can see it. This is INQ 000 514 574. And I think we can see that you had met him at a Department for Education advisory group.
Yeah.
And you set out in this letter, I won't go through every paragraph of it, but I think, did you essentially set out what you have described to the inquiry that the problems were?
Yeah. So effectively, I'm saying to Ofqual, there's no way of doing what you're proposing to do in a way that's basically fair to young people.
And if we go over the page, please. I think, first of all, in the first paragraph, you set out the fact that you have huge sympathy for the fact this is a really difficult task to do. And then you set out...
And, there's a good reason why we have exams, because it really is the only fair way of making sure this is equitable between young people. And we've just been told exams can't exist. So at some level, their job is impossible. The question is, how are we as fair as possible to the young people affected? And particularly, I guess I'm trying to emphasise in this letter and the following paper that's attached, how do we avoid detriment to young people? Because this year in particular, the costs of undergrading somebody are huge compared to the costs of overgrading somebody. If you're undergraded, you miss your apprenticeship or your sixth form or your university or whatever. If you're overgraded, well, look, that's undesirable in the overall scheme of things, but frankly, not the end of the world in a moment where we've got, a global pandemic.
And were you contending for unmoderated teacher-assessed grades going forward, or had you proposed something different to that?
No, I think I and everyone in education, being fair about this, would acknowledge that it was almost certain that what were called the centre-assessed grades, the grades that teachers would put forward unmoderated, would be inflated. And, there's a long history of that being the case through English education, that when teachers are marking things, they'll tend to be lenient to their own students where it counts. And so that is an issue, and that action should be taken as far as possible to avoid unreasonable grade inflation and introduce as much fairness as possible. But, as I say, recognising there has to be some leniency to deal with the actual uncertainty of the situation.
So, trying to characterise your approach, were you trying to find a sort of middle ground or a route through?
Yeah, so
problem?
In what I was putting forward was to put forward something which was practical, which was doable, that, having sat in that seat in my past, I'd have thought I could do this, and was, realistically going to introduce more fairness rather than less into the system without introducing too much risk that we start disadvantaging significant numbers of young people in an unfair way.
All right, I'll come back to that when we come to the final outcome of all of this, but just sticking with this letter for a moment, I think that you set out there, you're in the third, the paragraph that begins second in disregarding. So I think, is that the point you've just made, that this was a model that effectively set aside in large part what teachers would have assessed children to be.
Yeah, that's right. And Ofqual make the argument that teachers are better at rank ordering children than they are assessing them against an objective standard, which is, there are an awful lot of caveats to that, but that is broadly correct. When you're trying to do it across an enormous number of children, for example, GCSE maths in an 8th form entry school, 240 children, getting your rank order perfectly correct is essentially impossible. But leaving that aside, Ofqual wanted to say, look, rank orders we can believe, CAGs we just can't believe, and we'll only use them when we have to. So my view was that was a mistake, because you were discarding some really important information in just jettisoning them and not thinking about how to use them better.
And just if we drop down, please, to the paragraph that begins, I should stress my concern is only with fairness to students. With no accountability measures for schools this year, I don't think I can be accused of producer interest. That could be a point that was made about a head teacher trying to intervene, or a chief executive trying to intervene in this way, that you would have an interest in trying to produce higher grades.
Yeah. And of course, in a normal year, that would be a legitimate thing to be concerned about. This was not a normal year. We weren't going to have league tables. We weren't going to have, accountability measures. We weren't going to be using these in Ofsted inspections and so on. So I would like to think that I would have been entirely objective no matter what, but I don't think it's reasonable to think that somebody in my position putting forward that view would be doing so on the basis of their own interest, because I did not have an interest in this other than wanting fairness for students.
And I think if we go to the final page, where you say, I think you reiterate again, that you had been given a good deal of time by the chief regulator, and that, again, reiterating that your concern was fairness to children. Is that right?
Yeah.
And I think if we go then...
So this is right. That letter is right at the end of this process.
Yes.
After I've gone through really quite a lot of stages with Ofqual and the department, of talking to them, having meetings with them and so on. So this is my letter to the Secretary of State in July, so sometime through this process.
Yes, and if we go please to INQ 000514611. I think, in fact, Sir Gavin Williamson made time to see you in order to discuss this, yes?
Yeah, that's right.
So one assumes for someone who must have had huge demands on his time, he did make time to hear from you directly about what it is that you were worried about. Have you had a chance to look at this note of the meeting? It sets out that you had explained that you thought the model was flawed from an accuracy point of view, and more so from a fairness point of view, and that when it came to the results season, the picture would look very difficult. So again, did you broadly explain the things that you have explained here to the Secretary of State?
Yeah, so as untechnically as possible, really to reiterate, and I should say that at various points in my discussion with Ofqual and with the department, they had appeared to recognise that what I was saying was correct. So there seemed to be substantial recognition that they had understood that the point we were making, which was you can't do the thing that you're trying to do, had been taken on board and understood. And at various points, they'd promised to come back to me within a couple of weeks at one point and so on. And so this had carried on for a couple of months. And ultimately, this point of escalation to the Secretary of State follows quite an extensive engagement with the department at senior levels, with Ofqual at senior levels, including with Sally Collier herself. And I wrote to the Secretary of State really because we got to the point where I was sitting in a meeting with Sally Collier, which I thought was to follow up, right, what are we going to do about these concerns? And she just said to me, well, look, this is what we're doing, this is the decision, we need to go ahead now, I need your support for it. Which is pretty extraordinary when I've just spent a couple of months trying to explain to her and her team why actually it's a fundamentally flawed aim. So that was the point at which I wrote to the Secretary of State. I think he'd been briefed to some degree by his team. I explained to him briefly, really, that it's not possible to accurately model the grades in the way that they're doing, that they would be introducing serious unfairness for hundreds of thousands of young people, and that they were heading for disaster in August if they just carried on down this path.
And I think if we pick up from this note, and of course I emphasise it's a note from the meeting, no one has signed it to say it's accurate or anything. It sets out here, the Secretary of State concluded there wasn't an immediately obvious and logical route that avoids all the problems, that there would be winners and losers, and that he wants a system that is as fair as possible, arising from a less than perfect situation, and that it should be backed up with a strong appeal system and autumn exams. I mean, did you agree with that there would be winners and losers, and that this really was the best that could be done in all of the difficulty that everyone faced?
No. And, I mean, interestingly, I mean, this is a very civil service note of a meeting. What Gavin Williamson actually said to me is, well, I think you might be right, John, but I think it's too late now to do anything about it. So I think that's summarised as acknowledged these concerns and agreed that the situation would be challenging. He was firm that moderation was necessary. Well, moderation was necessary, but that wasn't what they were doing. They weren't moderating teacher grades. They were discarding teacher grades. There weren't immediately clear fixes available. I think we did discuss some clear fixes which were available. And it was still possible at that moment for him to direct Ofqual to do something different, a point that I made in writing subsequently to his special advisor, Joe Saxton, as well. I didn't advocate moving results day and never had. So the suggestion that you could avoid all problems, that's right, you can't avoid all problems because there must be some give in a system. You have to have some grade inflation if you're going to be as fair as possible. The system that they had introduced certainly would guarantee winners and losers, but they guaranteed equal numbers of winners and losers, and it was perfectly possible to have a system where you had more winners and many fewer losers. And that was the point that I was trying to get across to them.
Obviously, the point was reached where I think the model that you proposed wasn't accepted, and the exam, or not exam, but the grade that was produced was based on this model for both GCSEs and A-levels, correct? And can you just explain what happened then when those results came out? What it was that, what happened to the grades in terms of the extent to which they had been downgraded from teacher assessments?
Yeah, so, I mean, there were multiple different kind of public reactions to this. I mean, the first thing to say is it had just happened in Scotland already.
Yes.
So the exam system had fallen over in Scotland, and they'd eventually decided to go back to teacher grades. Now, for reasons that I think somebody else will have to explain, Ofqual were convinced that their model was in some way better than the Scottish model. Now, actually, it was. I mean, you could make that argument, but the idea that it would be more publicly acceptable, I think, was totally implausible because Scotland's was a more generous model than England's. So on the day that results came out, there was, I think, very predictably uproar because schools felt that children had been treated unfairly. A lot of children felt that they'd been treated unfairly. The outlying worst cases, where children who might have been expecting to get a B or a C got an E or a U, really hit the headlines. And these were things that were really impossible for anyone to try and defend. The government tried to put in this so-called triple lock fix before the results came out. That was widely condemned as invalid, though I think it would have helped a few people potentially.
Can I just ask you to pause there?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't it help to say, well, look, if you didn't get the grade you wanted, you can appeal? Why isn't that a fair solution to the problem?
Well, I put forward to the Secretary of State Special Advisor in mid-July. I said to her, look, at this point there are three possibilities for the DFE. One is DFE lets it run as it is, and I think this is the slow motion car crash option, I call that, and I think that's what we got. The DFE just let it run, and we got the slow motion car crash. Second option, which I thought was the best option, but would have been a politically brave option, was that the Secretary of State at that point could direct Ofqual and say, actually, in these circumstances, I want you to do this different thing. And the third option was to have a mitigation strategy. And I felt at that point that an appeals option, we had in our consultation document put forward a significant number of potential improvements and mitigations right back in April. And it felt by this time as though they'd just been simply ignored. There was a set of things that could have been done in April which had been ignored. By July, I felt that appeals and the appeals system and the thinking and the development around that was about, the best option if they weren't prepared to direct Ofqual. The problem with that, of course, with any appeals system is that trying to build it, and particularly trying to build it from results day onwards, was very difficult at that moment. It would have taken a lot of resource and time. A lot of anxiety was being generated by young people who thought they'd missed university places and felt that was unfair. It created uncertainty for universities as well. So I think they ended in a position where, having published these results, got an enormous backlash, realised they were in kind of PR difficulty. They probably had no option other than to say, right, we're going to just have to resort to the CAGs and to the assessed grades that teachers have submitted.
So that, I think, I'm going to fast forward. That's where I think it ended up. Is that correct? That it was the centre assessed grades that became. And in terms of your assessment of that as the outcome of this whole process, did you think that was a satisfactory outcome?
No, because I thought that you could have had a better outcome than that, which would have been fairer. I thought that if they'd done the things we'd suggested they did in April, about supporting schools to do this differently, about creating different incentives, about setting up a proper quality assurance process, and so on, they could have got a better result. If they'd used the alternative approach to including information from CAGs as well as a statistical process alongside it, that also could have delivered a better and fairer result. I think we can see in those results that there are visible unfairnesses. So there's more inflation in independent schools of grades. There's particularly more inflation in independent sixth form colleges, or so-called crammers, with some examples of really truly outlandish grading having been accepted. We can see that there are, FE colleges in some cases have got disproportionate increase in grade, and so on. So all of these things could have been improved upon and a fairer result achieved for young people.
I'm asking you all of these questions, Sir John, to really come to a sort of final point, which I hope to develop a bit further, about what this said to you about decision-making within government about children during the pandemic, and what was problematic about it, or whether there are broader lessons that can be extrapolated from this.
Yes, and I mean, some of these I think relate to other things that we may come to
Yes,
talk about
we
in
are.
due course as well. I mean, firstly, I feel strongly that there wasn't sufficient thought given to the starting point of what is the fairest thing we can do for young people? How do we avoid, in this very difficult situation, not of their making, detriment to individual young people? And that wasn't the starting point. The starting point was, how do we avoid grade inflation? And I think the reason for that was that that had been an entrenched plank of policy for such a very long time, that government had, made strenuous efforts over many years to remove grade inflation from the system, and that had become almost a fixed point of belief. So nobody was questioning that as the starting point and the objective. I think that there's a sort of strong element of groupthink here, of people thinking this is a thing we can do, and once they decided on that or lighted upon it, which I think they did very early, I think they did in March, that this is a thing that we can do before they even produced their first consultation document, they stopped thinking about, is there a better alternative, is there a fair alternative? It became a doable thing which achieved the objective. So I think that was an issue. I think there's a culture in government of people digging in and looking to repel borders, of saying, this is our policy and everyone else, we need to explain why this is wrong, lines to take kind of culture. I think in this case, maybe it was exacerbated by the fact that back in 2012, there'd been a sort of big row about examinations, particularly about the grading of English GCSE, where Ofqual had come under huge fire from the whole of the school system and had really dug in and defended its position. And strongly, part of its culture was the belief that we're the regulator, we're right, we're entitled to say what the standard is, and we should push back against other people trying to affect that. And I think that was part of it as well. I think the fact that there was a lack of expertise in the Department for Education, a lack of real educational expertise in the people dealing with this issue, people who were bright, well-motivated, hard-working, but simply didn't have a background in education, and particularly not in qualifications, which is, as we've seen, a technical area. And so there wasn't confidence in the department, really, to ask the right questions, to challenge Ofqual in the right way, and those things, I think, were important. I think, finally, there was a real lack of leadership, actually, amongst senior civil servants and leaders in Ofqual and at the political level. There was not a sense of, we are going to get this right for young people, come what may. And even in the statements that I've read on behalf of the department, on behalf of politicians, on behalf of the chief regulator, it's an extraordinary story of buck passing and of people saying, not me, Gov, I did the best I could in the circumstances, and relatively little, even now, reflection about how they could have done a better job and avoided an outcome which we all agreed at the outset would be a bad one.
So, John, I'm going to move on, if I may, to just asking you then about your involvement in the recovery group as well. So, is it right that that was a group of people who the Department for Education arranged to provide advice to it about how to help education and schools recover after in the initial stages of the pandemic?
Yeah, exactly so. So pulled together mid-April, called the recovery group, and in practice dealing with, the issues of the day as much as, the future of recovery, as it were.
I'm going to go straight to some documents that might help throw some light on the approach that was taken to this, and if perhaps we could go to INQ 000649527. And I just want to use this to ask you about some of the matters that you have set out in your witness statements. We can see this is an email of the 22nd of April, and if we could just scroll down, please. Thank you. We can see in the second paragraph that you're asking questions about whether or not the recovery group can have access to the scientific advice that was being provided to the Department for Education. And if we look at the second paragraph, you were saying that you would like it so that because you thought you needed to understand it if you were going to provide advice. And I think if we just scroll down a little bit, please. We can see, sorry, if you carry on scrolling down. This may not matter if I can't find it because you might be able to remember. Thank you. So I think you were also asking at the start of the next page, you also wanted, I think, to understand more about what the aims and objectives of the government were. And I think as well, you refer there to the fact that you had a confidentiality agreement with government as well. So standing back from that email, does it encapsulate some of the issues that you were facing as a member of this recovery group in being able to advise government?
Yeah, so I mean, this is only 5 or so days in, I think,
Yes.
from the first meeting. And so this is very much me sort of thinking this would be a very helpful thing for them to do, and that they would probably be willing to do that because they'd asked us to advise. And if we're to advise, we need to understand what is it you're trying to achieve and what is the basis on which you're making judgments. And so that's really what this email is asking for. And to be honest, I don't understand even now why that became a problem.
And was that because, for example, were you being asked to help at this stage to provide a strategy for reopening schools, for example, or did that come later?
Yeah, I mean, so the premise of the group really was we are here to advise on recovery. So we recognise this is a very difficult moment, schools are closed, and we're working on lots of things live at the moment. How are we going to improve remote education? What are we going to do about, the vulnerable, and et cetera, But really the focus of the group was to be on the future and how we would recover from this situation. And it was already clear that we might potentially be asked some quite difficult practical questions about, well, how would we reopen? Would this model be better than that model? And in order to answer that question properly, I mean, obviously we can advise on what's the easiest thing for us to do, but whether, and I think this became an issue over time, whether what we're seeing as a practical thing that can be done is consistent with what you think needs to be done in order to suppress the virus. Obviously we need more information than we currently have in order to advise properly on that. So really it was in order to make sure we could give useful advice, really.
And did this problem persist, that the recovery group wasn't being provided with scientific evidence or the data that government was working from? Yes,
and I mean, as we may see in other things in this pack, we were asked to respond very reactively to pieces of guidance and a piece of guidance which may change extremely quickly for reasons which were completely invisible to us. Sometimes, over a period of time, as we'll see in some of these documents, on occasion we were told that secondary schools would open, then that they wouldn't open, then they were back on the table, as I think one of the documents puts it. So we couldn't see why any of this was happening. We couldn't understand what was the basis for decisions that were being made or not made. And it made it very difficult to give good advice.
Can I, maybe if I just ask you to pause there, and if we just go to, I think, the document you're referring to, INQ 000649534. And I think, forgive me, I think we need to go to page 5 first, which is the start. So I think we can see this is an email of the 9th of May, and this suggests in the first paragraph that it's being put to you that secondary schools, it says, secondary is now back on the table for the 1st of June with an ambition for some face-to-face contact to supplement online learning. And then the rest of the email sets out some of the things that government were thinking about, and then it says, I'd be really grateful if you had any thoughts that leapt out for you on these initial propositions, or is there something we have missed? And then it goes on to say, clearly this is all very much up in the air. So is that what you mean, that these quite potentially, I suppose, quite significant decisions being put to you in this sort of email correspondence?
Yeah.
So not a sort of worked up, here's the policy we're thinking of promulgating. Could could we have your best ideas on it?
And I was fine with that in principle. I thought it was really appropriate for the department to ask us questions at an early stage of thinking, and to get our input to that. So I don't object to that in principle. I guess the point from the earlier email would be, and I suppose this is partly me having been a policymaker for a long time, I always thought the job of the policymaker was obviously to sort of balance interests and to try and understand what was the legal advice telling us, what was the scientific advice telling us, what would be practical in schools, what would this mean for individual children, what would it mean for members of staff and so on, and try and synthesize that into a useful proposition about, okay, what is it that we ought to do then? And on this point, I felt we just weren't well placed to do that, because we didn't have access to an absolutely essential piece of the jigsaw, which is some scientific advice about. Now, as I read it now, some of what we then experienced of rapid changes of direction and government suddenly veering off to do something different seems to have been. And I think this was clear at points, seems to have been as much of a surprise to the department and to officials in department, I think probably to ministers in the department, as it was to us. Sometimes it seems clear that Number 10 just decided to do something on the basis of, we're not clear what, but presumably some changed scientific advice. And a piece of work which the department had in fact spent quite a long time working up, and on which we'd invested a lot of time advising, was sort of thrown away and something quite different put in its place.
If we could just please go to page 1 of this email. And I think this is you just having a private word. And I think is this a sort of attempt to say this sort of approach isn't working, or this is difficult?
Yes, I think in this particular case, we'd reached the day before a scheduled announcement, and there were some completely different models in play of what ought to be done. And I suppose, as I say in this email, that raised my civil service antennae a bit. It's a long time since I've been a civil servant. If you get to the day before an announcement and you're not clear what you're announcing, you need to pull the announcement. It's a terrible idea to announce something that you haven't thought through properly. And if you've got such completely different options still on the table on the day before you're announcing something, really that's telling you you're not ready to announce it.
I'm going to just ask you then if we could come to the final bit of some of this email correspondence, which is INQ 000649536. And I think, first of all, Sir John, if we note the time of this email, you were writing it at 1:45 in the morning.
I hadn't noticed that, but yes.
And if we look at what you say, you start by saying, I don't know what to say, really. This isn't your fault, but I keep giving advice and commenting on documents being ignored and getting no feedback. does any of the advice from the advisory group actually make it to ministers? And if we scroll down a little bit, I think at about the midpoint of that email, it says, we have had multiple meetings in which no meaningful information was shared, and then a frantic rush at the last minute with apparently multiple policy changes in a very short period of time that we've had to guess what they are from the text. And then I think you say none of it tested on the advisory group. And insofar as we had opportunity to comment, we advised against what was proposed. And then, if we just go down to the bottom, please. I think you say, forgive me, it's at the bottom of page 12. You say, I've never heard the leaders of the large trust so concerned and so negative as they were at the meeting earlier this week. I think the department is in serious danger of losing friends and needs to take some care with the communication of this. Sorry, forgive me, I've got the wrong page. I'm looking at the page number on my page as opposed to the page number.
It's the next page,
But
I've got it here.
You've got it, thank you, I'm so grateful. So again, does that encapsulate some of the concerns that you had about the way policy was being developed at this point in time?
I think so, yes. That was me at my most sunny and cheerful. It was, I mean, as I say in this note, you know, it wasn't just me. You know, we were doing all we could to lean in, as it were, and help the department and give them useful advice. And, you know, there were people who were putting a huge amount of effort into doing this alongside their day job. And nobody was expecting, you know, particular thanks, and nobody was expecting that their advice would always be taken. But these frustrations that we simply don't know what happened to it, there was no feedback on it. It wasn't clear whether it had gone anywhere. There was a random last-minute change of policy, and after we'd spent a long time commenting on something, suddenly that wasn't the policy anymore, and there was no explanation as to why it wasn't the policy anymore. You know, it's frustrating to be on something called an advisory group and for it to feel as though your advice is going into a black hole and influencing nothing, and poor decisions are being made.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, because obviously if you might feel neglected or that you weren't being acknowledged or given feedback. But and that was the question I was going to ask you. Did you think that mattered though when you saw the outcome of the decision making?
Well, look, I think, you know, it wasn't about me, and I think all of us working on the group were, you know, very clear it wasn't about us. You know, we were trying to help, as, you know, millions of people across the country were doing their best in very difficult circumstances. There was nothing special about that in the circumstances. But when you put quite a lot of effort into saying, look, these things just won't work in practice, and we'll need to do it this way in order for it to work, or there's a better way of achieving that aim, and it's this, or just giving them some words which would land better with your peers, and then them reverting to the version that you told them wouldn't work or won't land well with your peers, and then seeing your peers disheartened and upset and feeling like bad decisions are being made. You know, and what I'm reporting about the despondent large trust chief executives, these are not a despondent group of people. They're a get-up-and-go group of people. And just feeling as though the decisions that were coming from government were making their lives unnecessarily difficult. And so, as you say, if what was coming out was excellent in ways that we hadn't considered or thought of, perfect. But actually what was coming out had all the flaws that we were identifying and was being received in that way by our colleagues.
And are you able to offer any insight as to what the problem was? Because people were reaching out to you from the Department for Education. They were asking you for your insight. So where do you think the impediment lay, or what was the problem in the situation?
Well, I mean, some of what I say in my covering statement is about the very visible centralisation of government in this period, that it did feel as though decisions were made outside the department in sometimes capricious ways by people who did not understand the issues that they were dealing with and had simply decided to overrule the advice they were given or possibly to ignore it. So I did at times feel for the civil servants who I think, particularly more junior civil servants working extremely hard and diligently to try to pull together good quality advice, really listen to the external advice they were getting and pull together something which reflected that but also achieved the policy objectives and was balancing different views and different interests and so on, only to find that for no reason that anybody could really explain, that idea had simply been overturned and something else was now the decision. So I think in these moments that was the most significant single factor, the over-centralisation of decision-making, the fact that, as we've heard, the department didn't feel empowered to do its own planning even at the outset and had to wait to be asked. Because, whilst that is a failure of leadership in the department, it doesn't come from a clear blue sky. This learned helplessness has come to be because of an extended period of over-centralisation of government, because people are waiting to be told by Number 10 and by the Treasury far too often. And there's a loss of cabinet government, really, in this country, in a way that, I'd really tried, once I'd left the department, to sort of stay away, really, from the department for quite a long time, to, not be treading on my successor's toes, as it were. And so coming back into this at this moment, of course, it was a particularly difficult moment, but it did feel like there was a very visible decline in departmental capability compared to what I'd been used to, and a decline in the ability of the department to set its own agenda compared to what I'd been used to. So, I mean, I think there are other factors as well, but in these points, I think that was very significant.
Just asked you to wait 1 second. Thank you. Sorry, I was just checking the time. Can I move on to ask you about a different point that you've made in your evidence? And I think these are two things that are interrelated to each other. I think you suggest in your evidence that you had concerns that there wasn't a sufficiently positive message being conveyed about the need to reopen schools and about the circumstances in which schools could be reopened. Is that correct?
Yes.
And was that a problem that you saw operating at different levels, as it were?
So I certainly felt that that in government there wasn't a clear enough articulation of the value and benefit of reopening schools, and I thought that wasn't clearly enough stated. As early as the 18th of March, just to make this point, I had sent round to our heads a simple graph from the Italian experience, which obviously had been going on through the previous month and 6 weeks, of mortality in different age groups in Italy, which showed us that nobody under the age of 18 had died of COVID-19 virus, and virtually all the mortality was in older adults. And obviously my purpose in sending this to our heads was to say, look, please reassure children and parents that they are not here at significant risk. Please also reassure your staff that they are not in significant risk. Obviously, we know we do have some older staff and some vulnerable staff, but for a young, healthy adult, this is not hugely risky. But particularly for children, this is not hugely risky. And that messaging, I thought, was not clear enough. It wasn't until August that Chris Whitty said, there will be more harm to children from not attending school in September than there ever would be from contracting the virus. Now, he said that in August. Of course, that was also true in March, and we knew it to be true in March. That doesn't mean it was the wrong decision. I'm sure this is something the inquiry will be looking at extremely carefully. I don't know whether it was the right decision or not to close schools in March, but I understand why that was the decision. But I don't think it should have taken until August for Chris Whitty, the health side, and the education side to be saying in very clear and loud terms to the whole of the country, look, the reason we're closing schools is not because children are at risk. Children are not at risk. We're closing schools in order to protect the wider population, at-risk people, the elderly, and to avoid damage to the NHS. But that first part of the message, that the children are not at risk, wasn't clear enough from government. And government did know well the harm that was being done to children by the closure of schools. It understood this, and this was part of our discussion, but it wasn't being loudly proclaimed that actually we want to get children back into schools as quickly as possible. And the decision-making that then followed from government showed that they didn't, in fact, prioritise. Eat Out to Help Out came before school. So some of this is, I think these are very big issues, and I think it is one of the things that continues to have impact today, that parents, children, and what's happening with school attendance now, is affected by the fact that we were not clear enough through this period that school's incredibly important, that school is an enormously important protective factor, that it matters particularly for the vulnerable, but it matters for all children, that it is good for children's physical health and it's good for their mental health, and being out of school is a bad thing. And they are much less at risk in school than out of school. And I think that a lot of that messaging could have been much earlier and much stronger and would have supported the general social acceptance of the reopening of schools at the earliest opportunity.
I'm going to pause there, Sir John. My lady, I think it has come to the short adjournment.
Certainly. Sir John, I understand you are content to come back this afternoon.
Yes, of course, my lady, no problem.
I'm really grateful. Thank you very much. Very well, I shall return at 2:15.